And today we're going to do an overview of the autonomic nervous system, or ANS for short, which is going to be comprised of the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. Now, this is a part of the motor division of your nervous system, but it's called autonomic. So it's basically an automatic way to do some sort of motor function onto effector glands and muscles to tell them what to do and when. Because think about it, look at these digestive glands, blood vessels, iris smooth muscle. You don't consciously control these, so they have to be controlled automatically by the autonomic nervous system. So again, the two branches are parasympathetic and sympathetic. The parasympathetic is going to prepare your body to rest and digest. So it's basically going to promote activities to calm your body down and to digest your food. The sympathetic, on the other hand, is going to prepare you for some stressful stimulus to make you either fight it off or run away from it, fight or flight. So we're going to start with the sympathetic nervous system, but what I want to tell you first is that both sides are going to be called a two-neuron system. So I'm going to jot that down now. They're going to be a two-neuron system. So really we're going to have a chain of one neuron talk to another neuron that will then talk to these tissues. So let's see what I mean by that. Inside of the spinal cord, from about T1 to L2, these are just basically levels of spinal nerves. Thoracic 1, right about here, lumbar 2, down about here, and that's where the first neurons of the sympathetic chain are going to be. We're going to name these neurons right here the preganglionic neurons. Preganglionic, they're technically sympathetic neurons, right? Sympathetic neuron. Now, why are we saying preganglionic? Well, because they're coming before this structure called the ganglion. This is the sympathetic ganglion. Sympathetic ganglion. Now, ganglion is a fancy way to say just a cluster of cell bodies. And in this case, we're going to have other neurons that we're going to communicate to. So we call these guys the postsynaptic neurons because they're going to be coming after this guy communicates to that guy. So all these guys will be called postsynaptic or postganglionic neurons. Okay, so how does this work? Well, anytime you need to communicate to these tissues, you're first going to have to stimulate these guys. Now, what's interesting about these guys is that the first neuron is going to be short and unmyelinated. So you see how I'm doing these little dots here? All of these neurons are going to be unmyelinated. Now, if you watch any of my other videos before, you know unmyelinated basically means it doesn't have the wrapping of insulation around it. So if you look at any sort of cable like this one right here that I'm kind of pulling up, you see basically that cable has some insulation around the outside. That helps to speed up the process of the wire itself. But these guys are so short, they don't need that myelin. They don't need the insulation to speed it up because it's just really, really close. So I'm going to say anytime I have a neuron that looks like this, it's going to be unmyelinated. Unmyelinated. Great, so that's the first neurons there. And these neurons, the first one, the preganglionic, are going to release a neurotransmitter. I'm just going to make as a circular black dot. And this neurotransmitter is going to be called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine is just a fancy word for a neurotransmitter made of an acetyl group and a cholinergic group. But the biggest important part I want you to know is that in order to even respond to that neurotransmitter, these postsynaptic neurons must have a receptor for them. So indeed they will. We're going to have these guys having receptors, and these receptors are going to bind perfectly to that acetylcholine so that these neurons can be stimulated to send their signal. Now these guys, these receptors, are called nicotinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors. And I'm just going to label them as N for short. So I'm going to write N all the way through. So again, preganglionic neurons communicate with the postsynaptic neuron that have nicotinic receptors that will respond to acetylcholine and thus send their action potential. Now, I'm going to pause there for the sympathetic side and then come over here to the parasympathetic side because it's actually very, very similar to what we just did. Indeed, in the brainstem, So brainstem, basically the medulla, the pons, we're going to have those parasympathetic neurons chilling out here. I'm going to label this as the brainstem. And we're also going to have them chilling down here from the S2 to S4, so sacral 2 to sacral 4 vertebrae. And these guys are going to be slightly different, but similar. Why slightly different? Well, their axons, their extending branch, are going to be really, really long. So they're going to come out to like here, we'll say. And these guys are also going to come out to about here. Okay, so what do we see here? These are long neuron chains. So what do long neurons need? They need myelin. So we are going to have myelinated axons here, designated by the solid color here. So anytime it's unmyelinated, we got the dots. Anytime it's solid, it's going to be myelinated because it is very long. Now these guys, these preganglionic neurons again, so I can label these as preganglionic because they're going to be coming before some sort of ganglia of neurons. And here are going to be the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons. Okay, so they're different than sympathetic because they're myelinated first, but they're the same because they release the same neurotransmitter. This neurotransmitter, once again, is going to be acetylcholine. I'm just going to shorten it up as ACH. And that acetylcholine will bind once again to the similar receptor type, or actually the same receptor type. These are going to be your nicotinic receptors. So if you get the question on a test, like what is similar between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, you can say the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, and the postsynaptic neurons will grab that acetylcholine with nicotinic receptors. Brilliant. Okay, I just gave you a test question there, teachers, and I gave you the test answer, students. Okay, so now what I want to do next is continue forward with the parasympathetic neurons first, because it's a little more straightforward. Sympathetic's a little more detailed. So let's hop over here to the postsynaptic neurons. Now these guys are going to be short and unmyelinated. So they're going to have short axons that will actually reach the variety of these tissue types, but they're going to release the same neurotransmitter. So once again, these are unmyelinated here. So I can write unmyelinated. And they will release a neurotransmitter you've heard of before. Once again, they will also release acetylcholine. So it just seems like an acetylcholine stream here, right? Now here's where things get a little interesting, because we have to focus on resting and digesting when we're talking to a variety of these tissue types with the parasympathetic nervous system. So on these effector muscles, we're going to have receptors for the acetylcholine. And that acetylcholine will go to a variety of different structures. So I'm going to point to several of them right now, including the digestive glands and the blood vessels surrounding them. It's going to go to the iris smooth muscle. It won't actually go to many of the arteries or arterioles. It's going to go to the heart. It's going to go to the smooth muscle around the airways. It's going to go to a variety of sphincters and muscles of the intestinal tract. Wow, and then these guys, the reason I pointed here is because they're going to deal with those structures. These guys will actually talk to other organs like the bladder, like the genitals, etc. Because they'll originate actually in the sacral region. Okay, so let's focus up here now. I was saying acetylcholine is going to bind to these guys and make some sort of effect on them. Well, up here, we're going to have receptors on all of these structures, and they're all going to look surprisingly the same. That's because these are all going to be called muscarinic receptors. I'm going to draw all these quick. And I'll differentiate them just a little bit, give them a little cool base here. And these are going to be your muscarinic receptors. So I'll label them muscarinic. If I say it enough, you'll remember it, right? Muscarinic. We'll label that as an M. Okay, now the muscarinic receptors, once again, will bind that acetylcholine, but it's not going to exert the same effect on all the tissues. In fact, the parasympathetic might stimulate a tissue or it might inhibit a tissue. So let's see what it does. Let's talk first about the digestive glands and the blood vessels. First off, the ones that actually communicate to the salivary glands, so I'm going to say salivary glands here, will be the cranial nerves originating here, cranial nerves 7, which is the facial nerve, as well as cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. When it talks to the pancreas, it's actually going to be traveling through the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. So again, that's just the track that it's taking. So I can rewrite these once again, VII, we can say IX for 9, 10 for vagus. Okay, so once acetylcholine reaches here, let me ask you the question first. What do you think acetylcholine will do, again for parasympathetic, to salivary glands? What do you think it'll do to the salivary glands? Or what do you think it'll do to the pancreas, which releases a lot of digestive enzymes? Well, both of these deal with digestion, right? Breaking down your food so you can absorb it. So it makes sense that acetylcholine is going to actually stimulate, I'll draw it in black, stimulate these tissues to release their enzymes to promote digestion. Wonderful. Now what's interesting is it'll also talk to the blood vessels. Now the blood vessels associated with your digestive tract need to open up, relax, in order to get the nutrients into them. So what's interesting is acetylcholine, while stimulating these glands, it's actually going to inhibit the blood vessels to open them up. And that aids in the digestive process, absorbing the food into those open blood vessels. All right, let's move on to the iris smooth muscle. So acetylcholine is going to be released by cranial nerve number 3. That's the oculomotor nerve. Carries parasympathetic neurons. It's going to talk to the iris smooth muscle. Now in this case, it's a little interesting. It's actually going to inhibit the iris smooth muscle, relaxing the muscle, or basically extending the muscle. And that, if we extend these lines, we're actually going to constrict the pupil. We're going to constrict the pupil. So I'm going to write that here, constrict pupil. Now that one doesn't make as much sense, like why are we constricting the pupil if we're resting and digesting? It'll make a little more sense with the sympathetic. Moving on, we're going to skip the vessels, go to the heart. This is going to be traveling down cranial nerve number 10, that's the vagus nerve. You will see the vagus nerve a lot, it shows up a lot. It's literally called the wanderer. If you want to write vagus, it translates to wanderer, because it wanders around a lot. Exhibit A, it's going everywhere. So when we talk to the heart with acetylcholine once again, we're resting, right? Resting. What do you want to do to the heart when you're relaxing? You want it to slow down. So I'm going to write some minuses here because we're going to slow down the heart rate. Slow down the heart rate because you're at rest, okay? You're chilling out. Next up, we're going to the smooth muscle wrapped around your airways. Now, this one's also interesting. It's traveling down cranial nerve number 10, again, the vagus nerve. And when we get to the airways, the parasympathetic nervous system actually stimulates these smooth muscles that's wrapped around those tubes of your airways. And that actually means that we're going to constrict the airways, bronchoconstriction. Now, that seems a little counterintuitive. If you're like relaxing, don't you want your airways to be open? Well, they're constricting, but they're not fully closing. It's just because you don't need as much air while you're relaxing, so they just kind of constrict and close them up ever so slightly. It's not going to ever close it up entirely. Moving on. Now, this one's a little fascinating. Now we're getting into the sphincters, so basically the close and open valves, essentially, of the digestive tract, as well as the muscular walls of the digestive tract that actually make the food move along in the tract. Let's start first with the muscular walls because it'll make a little more sense. What do you think parasympathetic would do to the muscular walls of the intestines? They'll likely stimulate them. So this is traveling down cranial nerve number 10, once again, vagus, and we are going to stimulate the smooth muscle wrapped around the walls because it's going to help with motility. We're going to move that food through the tract because we're digesting, right? Now, what's interesting is if we're contracting it, moving food, what do we need the valve to do? Well, we need the valve, the sphincter, better word, we need it to open up so the food can move through, right? So that's exactly what happens. Traveling down cranial nerve number 10, the wanderer, it is going to relax the muscles of the sphincter and it's going to help to open them or dilate them. Very cool. So we're moving the food and we're opening up the sphincter so it can continue passing through. Fantastic. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the bladder, genitals, all that stuff, but just know this is all controlled by the parasympathetic. But we also need the opposite to occur occasionally, right? Sometimes we need to open up the pupil. Sometimes we need to speed up the heart. Who do you think will do that? Sympathetic nervous system. Brilliant. So let's move over here to the sympathetic nervous system. And this one's really fascinating, okay? We're going to get to why here in a second, but just stick with me. And if this has been helpful so far, by the way, just like this video, subscribe to the channel. It won't hurt you one bit. So we've got these postsynaptic neurons here, and they are going to extend a very long way. This is going to be the myelinated portion, and it's going to come and communicate with all these variety of tissues. So we're going to draw them here and draw them here. Now, with the sympathetic neurons, once again, these are myelinated postsynaptic neurons because they're very long, travel into these tissue types, but they're going to release a different different neurotransmitter, my bad. And I'm going to draw that as a triangle. We're releasing a triangle neurotransmitter, and this guy is going to be called norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. Noradrenaline, I believe, is more of an English term, but norepinephrine is the universal term. Now, norepinephrine will bind to a variety of these structures to make them do different things to get fight or flight. But what you need to know is that there will be two different receptor classes we can bind to. The first one I'm going to draw like this. If I draw it like this is going to be either something called an alpha or beta receptor, alpha 1 or beta 1 receptor specifically, alpha 1 or beta 1 receptor. And anytime we bind something that has a 1, it is going to stimulate it. So I'm going to put a plus there. So if norepinephrine binds to alpha 1 or beta 1, we're going to stimulate that tissue. Where the flip side, if I have a double on the base with the receptor, like this, I'm just going to draw it like that. This is going to be either an alpha 2, because of the 2 lines, or a beta 2 receptor. And if it does that, if we have a 2 there, we're generally going to inhibit that tissue. Just keep that in mind as we go through it. Now, both of these are called adrenergic receptors. Adrenergic receptors. It's just a classification. And inside the adrenergic receptors, we got the alpha and the beta. Brilliant. Okay, so let's roll through what is actually going to happen. But before we do that, I want you to think about when you are about to walk in the forest and a bear shows up or something dangerous, like a coyote. I don't know if that would scare you, but it would scare me. When you encounter something dangerous, you want to get all systems a go, right? Like you want your iris smooth muscle to open up the pupil so you can see better. You want your blood pressure to increase. You want your heart rate to increase. You want your bronchioles to open up so you can breathe better. You want all of this to happen at the same time. Well, when we were talking about the parasympathetic, it was kind of localized, right? Like you're digesting, you're doing this. But in this case, we need a very widespread immediate response. So how do we do that when we have several different neurons? Well, check this out. Some sympathetic neurons, the preganglionic ones, will come and talk directly to the adrenal gland, specifically inside the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. And that adrenal medulla, when stimulated by norepinephrine, that neurotransmitter, it will release, interestingly enough, norepinephrine. So the adrenal gland is releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine, but instead of it acting as a neurotransmitter, we're actually going to have this dumped into the bloodstream. So here, the bloodstream is carrying this norepinephrine from the adrenal gland. Well, why is that important? Well, it's important because now the blood, we know, goes everywhere. So blood goes everywhere. That includes all of these tissue types. So what's fascinating is not only will some of these sympathetic neurons be releasing epinephrine to individual parts, we're also going to put it into the bloodstream that'll also go to all these individual parts so that we can make a widespread effect to get us in that fight or flight mode. Fascinating. So let's talk about what norepinephrine does to all these different tissue types. All right, let's hop up here. So we've got digestive glands like the pancreas and salivary glands. As you can probably predict, if we're in fight or flight, we don't give a crap about digestion. So we're going to have either the alpha of 2 or beta 2. We're going to act on them, and we're going to inhibit these digestive glands. Inhibit those digestive glands. Well, what's interesting is when we talk to the blood vessels, again, we don't care about absorbing food at this point. We're actually going to stimulate those blood vessels, thus constricting the muscles, narrowing them, because we're not focused on the intestines at that point. So we're narrowing the blood vessels. So I'm going to say vasoconstriction basically means narrowing the blood vessels. And that's actually one reason you kind of have a stomach ache if you're really stressed or in fight or flight, is because the blood is actually closing up inside your intestinal tract, and it kind of gives you that queasy feeling, okay? So we're constricting those blood vessels and basically shutting down the salivary glands and the pancreas because we're not eating right now, we're not focused on that. Moving to the iris smooth muscle, however, we need to open up the pupil so we can see better during this fight or flight scenario. So we're actually going to stimulate this smooth muscle. Thus, if we stimulate, contract all these lines, we're going to open up that pupil. So we're going to have pupil dilation. Wonderful. Moving on to the muscular artery. Oh, by the way, the receptor here, if we're constricting it, will be either an alpha 1 or beta 1. To be honest, I don't know. So it'll stimulate it. Now, muscular arteries. Muscular arteries are specifically going to have alpha 1 receptors. So they'll look like this. And when norepinephrine goes to these alpha 1 receptors from either the bloodstream or the neuron itself, we are going to stimulate them. We're going to stimulate the muscular arteries and thus vasoconstrict the arteries. Now, why would we want to constrict generally the muscular arteries of the body? Well, if we constrict the big muscular arteries of the body, we increase blood pressure. Increases blood pressure. Why would we want to do that? Because we're in fight or flight mode. We want to get that blood everywhere very quickly so we can feed the cells so we can run away or fight the thing. Now, once the blood gets to the tissues, we're going to be traveling through arterioles that will actually go into the capillaries to feed the cells. So what's interesting is when norepinephrine gets here, they're going to act on the arterioles of the muscles, and we're going to have beta 2 receptors. And when we bind to the beta 2 receptors, we're actually going to relax them. I'll explain this a little more in a second. So I'm going to say relax or open, vasodilate the arterioles in the muscles. Why? Because if we open up the arterioles right at the muscular tissue, like the cells doing the contraction, the running, or the fighting, if we open up the arterioles, we can feed those muscles better. So we want to open them up. This is very similar to when we open up the blood vessels in the digestive system when we're in parasympathetic, okay? Allowing it to absorb more. Now, in the skin, however, do we care about feeding the skin when we're running away from a bear? No, the skin's not helping us there, really. So what we do to the blood vessels in the skin is we're actually going to vasoconstrict them. So the skin will have either alpha 1 or beta 1 receptors, and we will constrict the blood vessels of the skin, vasoconstrict. That's actually one reason if we vasoconstrict the blood vessels in your skin, you appear pale because the blood's going away from the surface. Moving on, when we go to the heart, we're going to have norepinephrine come to the heart. We're in fight or flight. You don't have to think too hard about this one. We're going to have beta 1 receptors, and we're going to stimulate that heart. We're going to speed it up, higher heart rate, and we're also going to have higher strength of contractions. So the contraction strength will go up. You've probably experienced this before. When you're in a stressful situation, your heart beats really hard as well. That's because of the norepinephrine stimulating the heart. Now, moving on to the airways. When we're running away from the bear, we need to open up those airways. So we're going to have beta 2 receptors. And when norepinephrine comes and talks to it, it's going to relax them, thus bronchodilating the bronchial tubes, the airways, so we can open them up and get more air. Brilliant, we're almost done. Once we get down to the muscular walls of the intestines, we've got to think about this. What do the intestines do when you're in a fight or flight scenario? They basically shut down. We don't need to move food through the tract at that point. We're not worried about it. So in the muscular walls of the intestines, excuse me, we're going to have either alpha 2 or beta 2. And we are going to inhibit them. We're going to inhibit them because we're not moving food through the tract, we're relaxing the muscular walls of the intestines. However, if sympathetic comes to the sphincters, we're actually going to stimulate the sphincters and constrict them in sympathetic. Constrict the sphincters. And in the muscles, once again, we relax the muscles because we're not digesting. Why are we constricting the sphincters? Well, because if we're not moving the muscular walls, right, we don't want the food to go anywhere. So we're going to actually close up those sphincters, keep the food where it's at, and once again, that's one reason you kind of get that stomach ache when you are stressed. Okay, well done, y'all. We are through a lot of it, but I want to point out one last thing to make this all so much easier. Look at the effects of each. Do you notice a trend? Parasympathetic to sympathetic, parasympathetic to sympathetic. Do you notice that every time both parasympathetic and sympathetic act on something, they're always opposites, always opposites, always, oh, whoops, not that one, always opposites. Why is that? Because they are dual innervated and they exert opposing effects. Wonderful. So that is the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Thank you for watching. And once again, like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already.